Some people go through life without fully realizing how or why they ruin everything. My wife Francesca was one of those people. I thought I knew her better than anyone else, and I trusted her implicitly. She was my partner, my biggest supporter, the one person I could always count on. We had been together for years, and I never once questioned her loyalty. Little did I know everything was about to change. The night of the annual Sterling Enterprises dinner would be the night that shattered everything. I had worked tirelessly for years, putting in extra hours, going above and beyond, all in the hopes of securing a big promotion. It was finally within reach, and I knew I was one of the top contenders. This dinner wasn't just about the promotion, it was about recognition and future opportunities. I had worked hard for this moment, but as the evening progressed, something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening between my wife, Francesca, and my boss, Gerald. My suspicions grew as I observed the way they interacted, but I never could have imagined what I would later discover. That night would change everything, and the betrayal would be impossible to ignore. I had always been a firm believer in the value of hard work. The idea that if you put in the effort and sacrifice, you would eventually reap the rewards was something I lived by. For years, I worked at Sterling Enterprises, one of the most prestigious firms in the industry. While my colleagues were eager to leave the office at 5 p.m. sharp, I stayed behind, ensuring every detail was perfect. Whether it was refining reports or working on company strategies, I always went the extra mile. This wasn't just about doing the bare minimum. It was about building a future for myself and the people I cared about. My efforts were about to pay off in a big way. The annual Sterling Enterprises dinner was approaching, and this was the event where promotions were announced. It was an exclusive, formal occasion where top executives, clients, and employees gathered. To be called up during the evening meant your hard work had been recognized, and the next step in your career was assured. It wasn't just about a title, it was about increased pay, more opportunity, and a bigger role in the company. That night was supposed to be a celebration for me and Francesca, marking a milestone in both my professional and personal life. But what I couldn't have known was that it would mark the beginning of my worst nightmare. The night of the dinner arrived, and I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. It wasn't just because of the work I had put in to get to this point, but also because of the woman standing by my side. Francesca, my wife, looked stunning. She had always been effortlessly beautiful, but tonight she radiated elegance. Her presence at the event made me feel proud, not just for her looks, but for the way she carried herself in such an intimidating setting. The guests were high-powered executives and senior partners, yet she seemed so at ease among them. As we entered the venue, I introduced her to my colleague, and she engaged them in conversations as though she had known them for years. She smiled, laughed, and made small talk with ease, and I watched in admiration as everyone seemed drawn to her. She was the perfect partner, charming, intelligent, and graceful. In that moment, I couldn't help but feel thankful to have her by my side. But as the evening went on, I started to notice something that made me uneasy. Francesca, who had always been a social butterfly, seemed to be spending more time with Gerald, my boss. At first I told myself it was nothing. She was just being friendly, right? But deep down, a nagging feeling started to grow. Something wasn't right. As the evening wore on, I found myself becoming increasingly uncomfortable with how much time Francesca was spending with Gerald. He was a powerful man in the company, respected, influential, and the kind of person who controlled promotions and career advancements. At first, I told myself that she was just being polite, engaging in friendly conversation. After all, Gerald was an important figure in my career, and I didn't want to make a scene over something so trivial. But the more I observed, the more I noticed how closely they were interacting. Gerald was leaning in a little too close, and Francesca was laughing a little too hard at his jokes. It felt as though they were forming a connection that went beyond mere politeness. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen before, a way that made me feel like an outsider. My gut was telling me something was off. Then things escalated further when Francesca excused herself to take a call. I didn't think much of it at first, but as time passed and she didn't return, I began to feel uneasy. I checked my watch, and 20 minutes had gone by with no sign of her. Another 10 minutes passed, and I still hadn't heard from her. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover something that would change everything. 30 minutes had passed and I still hadn't seen Francesca. Panic began to rise within me. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I casually began to scan the room, searching for her, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the crowd. I checked the bar, hoping she might be chatting with someone there, but she wasn't there. I moved to the balcony, a place where guests often stepped out for some fresh air, but she wasn't there either. That's when it hit me. Gerald was nowhere to be found either. A cold realization crept over me. My mind started connecting the dots. Something wasn't right. My heartbeat quickened, and before I even realized what I was doing, my body was moving on its own. I began walking through the venue, driven by an instinct that I hoped was wrong, but deep down I knew I was about to confirm my worst fear. As I turned down a quiet hallway near the restrooms, I heard muffled voices. I slowed down, straining to listen. Then I heard something else, a muffled moan. My heart dropped. I knew then that I had found what I feared most. This was no longer a gut feeling, it was reality. I called out for Francesca, my voice a mix of uncertainty and panic. There was no answer at first, just an eerie silence. Then I heard a rustling sound, the kind of noise you hear when someone is trying to cover something up. My instincts screamed that I had found what I was looking for, but I wasn't prepared for what I would witness next. I slowly approached the door, heart pounding in my chest, and called out again. Francesca? No response. But the hesitation, the sudden stillness in the air told me everything. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I quickly pulled it out and hit record, knowing this was the moment that would change everything. The door creaked open and Francesca stepped out first. Her hair was a mess, strands falling loosely around her face. Her dress was wrinkled and she looked guilty, flushed, and panicked. Behind her came Gerald, looking far more composed, but his tie was loosened and his shirt was undone. The truth was clear. In that moment, everything I had built, my trust, my marriage, crumbled before me. No words were needed. I didn't feel rage or anger. I just felt numb. I stood there recording them as they tried to process what was happening. Gerald stiffened as he realized he had been caught, and Francesca immediately pleaded with me. Matthew, please. She started, but I wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. I didn't want explanations or apology. The truth was already clear. I kept the camera on them for a few more seconds, letting the weight of their actions sink in. Their lies, their deceit crumbled in front of my eyes. After a few moments, I stopped recording and turned to walk away. I didn't need to say anything to either of them. There was nothing left to fix, no words that could change the fact that my wife had betrayed me. I didn't care about the promotion anymore. I didn't care about anything. I walked away, my mind numb to everything happening around me. As I left the venue, my phone buzzed with messages from Francesca. I didn't even look at them. There was nothing left to say. Francesca eventually arrived home, hours later, tears streaking down her face. She stood at the door, looking at me with eyes full of desperation, but I didn't want to hear her explanations. She didn't say a word at first, but I knew what she was thinking. She was hoping for something, some reassurance that things could go back to normal, but I had already made up my mind. The marriage was over. She started to speak, her voice breaking as she begged for forgiveness, but I simply raised my hand to stop her. I didn't want to hear it. I was done. There were no tears, no yelling, no emotional outbursts. There was only silence. I didn't want her apologies. I didn't want anything from her. The damage had already been done. She stayed by the door silently pleading for me to say something, but I remained silent. I couldn't even look at her. I felt nothing but emptiness. I went to bed that night, and the next morning I woke up knowing that I had already made my decision. There was no going back. We were done. After our separation, life started to return to normal. I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. I wasn't interested in the gossip at work, and I didn't care about the whispers behind my back. Everyone wanted to know what had happened at the company dinner, but I refused to engage. Francesca still hadn't grasped the gravity of her actions. She sent me messages, called me, tried to apologize, but I didn't respond. I had already moved on. I realized that some betrayals can't be undone. No matter how much someone regrets their actions, once the trust is broken, it's gone for good. Francesca sent me a text weeks after our separation asking to talk. She said she missed me, but I just read the message and deleted it. There was nothing left to say. I had made my choice. She made hers. And in the end, I was better off without her. The betrayal wasn't just about her cheating. It was about her lack of understanding for what she had done. Some things can't be fixed. The days following the separation were both the most painful and liberating of my life. I moved out of the apartment we had shared for years, a place that once felt like home but now felt like a prison. It was strange, walking through those empty rooms, the walls echoing with memories that no longer seemed relevant. I could feel the weight of every moment we had spent together. Happy moments, sad moments, even the quiet ones. But none of it mattered anymore. What hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the feeling of being completely blindsided by the person I trusted most in the world. As I settled into my new apartment, a small but cozy space, I found myself drowning in a sea of mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt free from the lies, free from the manipulation. On the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of loss. I had invested so much into that relationship, believing that we had something real, something lasting. But now, all that remained was an empty apartment and the weight of betrayal. Slowly, I started to rebuild, focusing on myself and my career. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a sense of normalcy return to my life. Work became my sanctuary, a place where I could throw myself into something productive and meaningful. I was promoted shortly after the dinner, as expected, but it felt hollow. The recognition was bittersweet. Still, I did my best to take it in stride and make the most of my new position. I found myself leaning on my friends more, people who had been with me through the ups and downs of life. Among them was David, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. He had always been a source of strength, someone who knew how to lift my spirits when I needed it most. One evening, he invited me out for a drink, and I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to dive into socializing again. But I accepted his invitation. That night, over drinks and laughter, I realized just how much I had been suppressing my emotions. David listened to everything I had been through, without judgment or interruption. His support was exactly what I needed. For the first time in months, I began to feel like myself again. It took time, but slowly I started to heal. I focused on things that brought me peace, going for long walks, reading, rediscovering old hobbies I had abandoned. There was something therapeutic about reintroducing these simple pleasures back into my life. I had spent so much of my time living for someone else, trying to make a relationship work that no longer suited me. Now, for the first time in years, I was living for myself. And while I would never forget the betrayal that had shattered everything, I found solace in knowing that I was strong enough to rise above it. I met new people, went on dates, and started to envision a future that didn't include Francesca. It was a strange feeling, looking ahead with optimism, despite everything that had happened. One evening, as I was out with friends at a new restaurant, I met someone. Her name was Emily. She was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. She made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. I wasn't sure where things would go, but for the first time I allowed myself to be open to the possibility of new beginnings. The future no longer seemed so uncertain. Months passed, and life began to feel like it was moving forward. But one day, Francesca reached out to me again. It had been a while since I'd heard from her, and at first I wasn't sure how to react. I had closed that chapter of my life and didn't want to open it again, but she seemed insistent. Her message was simple. Can we talk? I need to explain everything. I debated whether to respond. My first instinct was to ignore her, to continue living my life without her intrusion. But something inside me told me that this wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. It was about getting closure, not for her, but for me. I agreed to meet her, though I was nervous about what the conversation would bring. The meeting took place at a small cafe. When I saw her, she looked different, more mature, more tired, as though the weight of her own choices had finally caught up with her. As we sat down, she apologized, genuinely this time, not just for the affair, but for everything she had put me through. She admitted that her actions had been reckless and selfish, and she was truly sorry. I listened, but I didn't feel anger anymore. I had already moved on, and I was no longer the person who had needed her in the first place. The conversation was civil, but there was no going back to what we had. We both understood that. When I left that cafe, I felt a sense of relief. The past was finally in the past. Months later, Emily and I became more than just friends. I had never expected to find love again so soon, but with her, everything felt natural. She was patient with me, understanding that I had been hurt before and needed time. I took things slow, not rushing into anything, but over time I realized just how much I cared for her. Emily showed me a kind of love that didn't come with strings attached, a love that was patient and gentle, the kind I had always hoped for. It wasn't about grand gestures or flashy declarations. It was about the little moments we shared, the quiet dinners, the spontaneous adventures, and the way we could talk for hours about anything and everything. With Emily, I felt like I could finally be myself again. I no longer carried the baggage of my past, and I could look to the future with excitement instead of fear. In the end, the betrayal that had torn me apart had led me to something better. I learned to trust again, to love again, and to embrace the future with open arms. Life had a way of surprising me, and for the first time in a long while I welcomed it. Welcomed